So Shandy's question is, Janet Yellen gave a speech on income inequality in 2014. She was criticized by some in the House of Representatives that it's straying outside of the topics that the Fed should be focused on, and that maybe it's promoting liberal policies is what the criticism was that Shandy said. And how do I think about those potential criticisms for us announcing this initiative? As I wrote about in the remarks, I look at our maximum employment mandate and I take it very seriously. And the fact of the matter is it's not just about headline unemployment rate. It is about making sure that all Americans who want a job are able to get that job. And so to me, addressing this issue is at the core of the Federal Reserve's mandate that Congress has given us. And, you know, I'm the guy who ran the TARP. You know, my old boss likes to joke that 60% of Americans are against torture, 90% were against the TARP. It was the right thing to do. And so this is the right thing to do. And if people want to criticize us for doing the right thing, I'm happy to take that criticism.
Hi.
Hi.
Jason Lang with Reuters. To follow up on that question, I'm not sure if you mentioned income inequality in your remarks. I believe you didn't. Is that?
I don't think I specifically called that out.
And it seems like you made more focus on income mobility, opportunity, and you used this language that seems to be more amenable to both sides of the aisle in the sense of focusing on opportunity, mobility, rather than income inequality. And I'm wondering if that was on purpose, and two, if you think that there's a political moment now that maybe would allow more progress on an issue, and the way you chose your language and the way you're orienting the Institute has that in mind.
And did everybody, Shandy, did you hear the question?
No.
Okay, so the question was that the language I chose, opportunity, inclusive growth, instead of income inequality, was that strategic to try to make this more amenable to people on both sides of the aisle? Well, I'm very happy to be bold and take a lot of risk, and I try to be bold and take risk in ways that bring people together. And so if you look at what we did on Too Big to Fail, we united the Wall Street Journal editorial board and Bernie Sanders. All right, that doesn't happen very often. And if we can tackle this issue in a way that brings people together on both sides of the aisle, I think we're going to be more effective than if we are potentially picking one side over the other. And so, yes, it is by design that we're focusing on ways of tackling these very important issues in ways that both sides of the aisle can embrace.
You kept saying that the problem is decades in the making. You know, the problem. I think you're referring to the problem of racial economic disparity, and I think a lot of people in this room would have probably said, "Wait a second, this problem is centuries in the making." And I wonder why, you know, if you thought about talking about slavery or not, and if you thought about it, why didn't you?
Well, so the question is, I said these problems are decades in the making. I could have said centuries, and did I purposely not talk about slavery, or did I think about it? Again, this is in the spirit of trying to make this initiative as broad as possible. Racial disparities are enormously important. But as one of the questioners also said, and I mentioned, there are issues of poverty all around this country that are not unique to any one race. And so again, it's just the spirit of trying to make it as broad an initiative as possible. And you know, I really believe it. If we can create, for example, an education system that works for kids with the most challenged backgrounds, it's going to work. You know, you solve the hardest to solve, and you've solved it for everybody. And so I want to make this initiative as inclusive as possible for a lot of reasons, because there are a lot of people who need help.
Do you feel the more inclusive it is, the more possibility or potential it has to be realized?
I do.
Politically?
Politically. I mean, I think we are a non-political organization, but we'd be foolish to ignore the political landscape that we are operating in. And so by trying to design, you know, I recognize that some will say we're getting out of the normal mode of operations for the Fed. I'm fine with that. But I'm going to do that in a way that tries to bring people from both sides of the aisle together to solve these issues.
Some people have criticized liberals for saying they can't see white poverty, but you're seeing white poverty.
Yeah, when I travel around the 9th District, you see it. You go into rural communities. Rural communities have been struggling for decades in many cases as the economy has changed and populations have left. And so white poverty is very important too.
Neel, can you talk a little bit about your outlook for inflation, how you're thinking about new fiscal policy potentialities, and whether you're a little bit more concerned now that those could lead to higher inflation and interest rates without a real growth boost?
Well, the question, Shandy, was about my outlook for inflation and my concerns of potential increasing inflation if there's new fiscal stimulus, as an example. The truth is, I don't know what the new administration or the new Congress are ultimately going to enact. And I don't feel like I have enough information to meaningfully change our forecast of the economy until we get some more clarity on what those policy, at least the proposals look like, let alone what's going to be enacted. And so markets have signaled some optimism, though they've given back some of that in recent weeks. And so I think markets, I'm interested to see what markets are saying. But markets are notoriously bad at predicting political outcomes. Markets didn't predict Brexit. They didn't predict the presidential election. I have no greater confidence that markets can tell us exactly what the new Congress and the new administration are going to do. And so I want to see a lot more information before before that really changes my perspective.
You mentioned you were going to try to avoid replicating things that have gone on elsewhere. Do you see any areas that are more potentially worth your exploring?
Sure. Well, some of the advisors, as we've talked to them in just designing this institute, have said to us, we really struggle as academics in universities to get access to data, and that perhaps the Federal Reserve has access to data sources that they don't have access to. And that might be a way that we could partner with them and make a contribution. I mean, obviously, we have to protect the data and provide appropriate controls around it, but we want to explore that. That's one suggestion that some have made to us. We also bring, it's very different when you're in a policy body and you're working with economists there. There's a laser focus and a real appreciation for how do you take this and put it into action, as opposed to just theoretical ideas, which are interesting and important. And so I think that that's something else we're going to bring is, okay, these theoretical ideas are great, but we're one big step closer to how would we actually, if we were able to, how would we actually put this into action? Would it be scalable? And so I think just having these same conversations under the roof of a very focused policy institution, I think that itself is going to lead to us asking different questions and looking at problems differently.
You mentioned sociologists. That there is this current in America that if you're poor, it's your own fault. Some people do believe that.
Well, look, that's what goes back to
Calvinism.
it goes back to this question of opportunity. I mean, I do think that obviously people have to take at some level responsibility for their own lives. Government, in my opinion, government doesn't guarantee outcomes, but we sure as hell can try to guarantee opportunity. And if everybody in America has an equal, high-quality opportunity, then they can choose to take advantage of that opportunity or not.
If I could follow up on the question on the fiscal outlook, and you mentioned that you don't have enough information to change your current forecast. I presume you were referring to your SEP input. Could you talk a bit about the balance between whether it's a fiscal stimulus, say short term, that increases aggregate demand, versus potentially productivity enhancing fiscal policies, how important that may or may not be for your outlook once you get that information, and also your views on when it may be appropriate for the Fed to consider shrinking the balance sheet.
Well, I think in terms of the mix of what the fiscal stimulus could look like, more stimulus in the short term versus longer term measures to increase productivity, I think clearly, to the extent that we would have our wish list, it would be focused on long-term productivity enhancements to the economy. I mean, that's, as you know, the great conundrum is why productivity has been growing so slowly the last many years. And so anything we can do to get productivity growth will be beneficial, not just for the Fed achieving our mandates, but for economic outcomes for everybody. And so I think generally speaking, that's a good rule and would encourage the focus to be there. What was the latter part of your question?
Balance sheet.
Balance sheet. Well, I don't, it's hard to speculate. I mean, again, it's going to depend on the outlook for inflation expectations, and what that fiscal mix ends up looking like, whether we have some confidence that it is productivity enhancing, or if it's purely just a short-term boost to aggregate demand, and the timing of that. One of the things we learned in the last stimulus is these things the effects can somewhat be unexpected. Maybe they take longer to take effect. Maybe the effects are different than expected. We need a lot more information, in my mind, before we can make any forecast about what it would mean for the balance sheet.
Neil,
Yes.
I have two questions. One is that there is a long list of problems that's out there in this new institute. What would be maybe the first 2 or 3 problems that you want the group to really hone into? Secondly, you ran for governor as a Republican, and we know that in a few days we'll have a total Republican-controlled government from the White House to Congress. How much that influence will be when historically that party has not seemed to look at communities of color in the same light as they look at people who are well off in some respects?
To your first question, we really want to let the research guide us in terms of where we can make the biggest contribution, where we can have the most benefit for our investment in terms of our research time, and then potentially of people taking it forward. But having not yet done the research, my gut always goes back to education. That I feel like that's the if we had to pick one thing that could be transformational for communities, it's making sure every kid gets a good education. But I don't want to prejudge it. We need to let the research lead the way. I'm in a position where I'm not supposed to comment on politics, so I'm going to respectfully pass on your second question.
Could you give us a sense of like what sort of resources you're devoting to this new institute in terms of like either funding or headcount or like percentage of your research department's time that's going to be focused on this?
Sure. This will be an expansion of our research department, and for starters, what we put in the materials is we're expecting 3 to 5 visiting scholars per year, at least as a starting point. And we're trying to focus on, hopefully we'll get lots of scholars applying, and we'll be able to pick the 3 to 5 that we think should have the best research proposals and could be the best fit for working with the existing economists. Part of this is also sending a message around the Federal Reserve System and around the country that these issues are important. So you know what some professor has said to me? One professor said to me, by showing that the Federal Reserve really cares about these issues, maybe we can influence the top academic journals in what topics they end up publishing in those journals. And if we have that kind of influence, all of a sudden that sends a signal out to researchers all around the country and around the world who want to publish in those journals that these are important topics. And so part of it is the core research we're literally going to be doing in the walls of the Federal Reserve, but part of it is getting the rest of the research community saying, these are really, really important topics. You should pursue it too. That's why the quote from Chair Yellen that I was really pleased that she offered us was a message to people inside and outside the Federal Reserve System that these topics are important, and she hopes that they will focus or they will contribute to work in these areas. So our own dollars may not be massive, but the multiplier effects could be very large if we're successful.
We have time for one more.
Can you say anything? You can go ahead.
Go ahead.
You spoke to mostly a group that was maybe with the Fed or high-level type of people. How can you translate this from this new institute to the common folks? Why they would understand this? Why would this be important to them?
Well, that's partly why we need the help of the groups that were here today to help us with that translation, because they're having those conversations. But look, I travel all around the 9th District. My colleagues do as well, meeting with families, men and women, kids of all colors. And my message to them is, we want every person in the 9th District and in our country to have an opportunity to get ahead. And that's what this institute is focused on, figuring out how to achieve that. We know it's not easy, but we're going to do our part to try to make it happen.
Can I ask another question? I don't know if everyone's had a chance to go yet.
Go ahead,
All right, you're the last one, then we're going to wrap up. Go ahead.
Okay. The whole issue of economists providing research on a lot of these different topics has sort of actually come to the fore in the election, because there's a feeling, I think, amongst the academic community that they're not really being listened to anymore, and that the study of economics is sort of an elitist pursuit, and that it doesn't jive. Solutions don't jive with the solutions that people want to see. And so it's interesting to me that your solution is sort of essentially like bring more economics into the discussion. I'm wondering how you think about that, how you think about that challenge, because it seems to very real to a lot of economists right now. It's not really, being listened to.
Yeah. I think that's a fair observation, but I think that if you think about issues like trade, where I think generally speaking the economics profession has just been saying for the last many decades, freer trade, more trade is unquestionably better. And I think it is better at the aggregate levels, but we're learning, and we've learned that there are real consequences. There are winners and losers associated with it, and we need to pay more attention to the distributional elements. And so I think what we're doing here with this institute is hopefully embracing the economics profession, and not just economics, but the research profession, to dive into those distributional effects and figure out, okay, we want a higher growth economy, but let's not close our eyes to what the distributional impacts of that higher growth economy are, and how do we help so that everybody gets a chance to participate in that growth. So I think in a way that this is maybe helping the profession apply their many, many skills in a way that society can embrace the results of, so it doesn't feel so removed.